Hello to everyone. Today I'm going to be explaining how the 14th Amendment has affected civil liberties in the United States from the time of its passage at the end of the Civil War. Now, in the very beginning of the United States, despite what the Declaration of Independence has stated, not everyone in the country was created equal. The only people who really got proper treatment were the middle-aged, wealthy white men. It was a far different time than it is today. But as the centuries have passed, civil liberties have been extended to benefit people of all sorts of backgrounds, which effectively means more representation in society, which thus means a healthier democracy and republic. Now, before I begin, I believe it's important to define what a civil liberty is. What that just means is that it is a thing that the government cannot take away from you. This means like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. Now, ever since it was passed, the 14th Amendment is probably most well known for its equal protection under the law that states everyone must be treated equally. Now, the 14th Amendment is probably one of the longer ones in the Constitution, because there's also other clauses, such as the Citizenship Clause that I'll be talking about later, as well as due process of law. And there's even one of the parts of the amendment says that anyone who participates in an insurrection against the United States is ineligible to run for office. Now, there's 3 Supreme Court cases that I want to talk about when it comes to civil liberties and the 14th Amendment. And the first one is the United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Now, Wong Kim Ark was a baby that was born in San Francisco, California, to Chinese immigrants who did not have U.S. citizenship. The Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment that I was talking about states that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, or citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, end quote. Now, for the time period, it kind of seemed like this would have only applied to the African American slaves. It was just kind of strange at the time period, because I believe it's important to provide context for this, but at the time period, there was legislation that was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which at the time banned Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States and getting citizenship. Now, the U.S. government, they ended up going against this, and in the end, it went to the Supreme Court, and in 1898, the Supreme Court sided with Wong Kim Ark, which established the very concept of birthright citizenship. Now, the next example that I believe is important to bring up is the right to an attorney as guaranteed in the 6th Amendment being extended by due process in the 14th Amendment. This was the case Gideon versus Wainwright, and in this case, a Florida man by the name of Clarence Earl Gideon had been charged with breaking and entering with the intent to commit a misdemeanor, which is a serious felony under Florida state law. So when it came to trial, the judge had refused to give him an attorney because of a state law at the time that only provided attorneys to poor defendants who had capital offenses, which is essentially just an offense that could give you the death penalty. Now, this basically meant that Gideon would have to defend himself, but he ended up accepting a plea deal and pled guilty, which resulted in him given 5 years in prison. Now, he later on went to file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in the Florida State Supreme Court, and they denied his petition. So as a result, Gideon went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and a unanimous decision sided with Gideon, stating that the 6th Amendment right to counsel applied to state courts, not just the federal ones, through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. In their ruling, the Supreme Court stated, quote, lawyers in criminal courts are necessities, not luxuries. This noble ideal cannot be realized if the poor man charged with a crime has to face his accusers without a lawyer to assist him, end quote. Now, this is an important extension of civil liberties because it establishes a better justice system, because not everyone is lucky enough to have law degrees. Not everyone is lucky enough to afford an attorney. And if you don't have an attorney, then there's not really much of a justice system to you. It's kind of biased in favor of a prosecution if you don't even have someone to defend yourself. It's just not right. Now, the final case that I believe needs to be discussed is about interracial marriage and its application of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause states that no state shall, quote, deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, end quote. Now, the case I'm referring to is Loving versus Virginia. Now, at the time period, the United States and a lot of other countries had what was known as the anti-miscegenation laws, which prohibited interracial marriage and intimacy. Several states had these laws in the books, including the state of Virginia, when they had what's called the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. So in 1958, a black woman, Mildred Loving, and a white man, Richard Loving, used a loophole to evade this state law. They went to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal. And upon returning to their state, shortly after, they were arrested and sent to prison for the marriage. Now, the couple ended up going to the Supreme Court of Virginia, which upheld the ruling. So then they ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court, which unanimously sided with the Loving couple and overturned the anti-miscegenation laws. I believe this is another good step because of its equal protection. Because marriage does not have to be between two people of the same race. It can be of different races too, and there's nothing wrong with that. So this equal protection clause was established with this, and I believe this is an incredibly important extension of civil liberties, of the extension of equality. And it's kind of like the same basis for other rulings, such as Oberhill versus Hughes, which ended up ruling that restrictions on same-sex marriage were unconstitutional. And it's also kind of the basis for other things such as the Civil Rights Act. Well, without this one part, people would be treated way differently today if this one clause was not in the 14th Amendment. Now, I want to thank everyone for taking their time to listen, and I hope you really understand where I'm coming from. Now, people can talk about the first, the second, the fourth, the fifth, the 10th, all these other amendments, but the 14th one I feel like is one that's just, it's not really talked about. The only real time I really hear people talk about it is like in the context of like if people determining like who runs for office in some cases. But I feel like people need to learn that there's so much more to this one amendment than what the eye looks at. And I hope people will understand what it is and be grateful that it's here for us. Now, thank you for listening, and I hope you have an amazing day.